Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Raj Pasoor. I'm a consultant psychiatrist at the Bethlehem Royal Hospital and visiting Gresham Professor for the Public Understanding of Psychiatry. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for this, which is the last in our season of lectures on mental health given by distinguished professors of psychology and psychiatry at the Institute of Psychiatry, which is the research arm of the hospital where I work and I practice in the NHS. I'm delighted to introduce to you this evening an extremely distinguished professor of psychology, David Clarke, whose unit at the Institute of Psychiatry has done pioneering work in developing new treatment approaches which are evidence-based of a psychological nature for problems around things like anxiety. And this work is very important and increasingly moving up the political agenda. Some of you may be aware that government ministers have been talking about establishing a new program of rolling out psychological therapies so that they should be more available to the public, but in particular evidence-based psychological therapies. And David Clarke is possibly the world authority on evidence-based psychological therapy. So I think it's going to be a very interesting evening this evening. But one final point I want to make is that he's going to be talking about social anxiety in particular. And this is something that many people often haven't heard of, and we've often heard of things like depression, but it's possibly the case that anxiety might actually be more common than depression. But social anxiety is certainly one of the commonest anxieties. Many people are aware of phobias and things like spider phobias, but social anxieties, which are fears to do with being with other people, are actually probably some of the most common anxieties. And these are fears and anxieties that have dramatic implications for people's lives. Children with social anxiety are much more likely to drop out from school, and social anxiety as a child is a key predictor of whether you go on to develop alcohol problems or drug addiction problems as an adult. And maybe these are children who are trying to medicate their social anxiety away. So I hope you join me in welcoming Professor David Clarke talking on a very important subject this evening, anxiety and its treatment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raj. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with you this evening. And what I'd like to do in the next 40 minutes or so is take you briefly through some of the general features of social anxiety, and then take you through some of the work we've been doing at the Institute of Psychiatry, trying to develop more effective treatments for this very troubling problem. Firstly, a word or two about the distinction between anxiety and anxiety disorders. Anxiety is an emotion that we all experience from time to time, and we do that for very good reasons. It's been built into us, we've inherited it from our evolutionary past, because in general, anxiety has a survival function. If there's a real danger for primitive man, if there's a saber-toothed tiger in the background, and you just get a sign that the tiger may be there from a rustling in the trees, then anxiety kicks in an adaptive way. You freeze, you stop doing whatever you are doing, you devote all of your attention to that spot where the tiger might be, and your body reacts with a big release of adrenaline, an increase in blood flow to the muscles, getting you ready to run as fast as you can. And if there's someone else with you who doesn't run quite so fast, then you might survive because the saber-toothed tiger will get that person instead. So some anxiety is adaptive, not only for primitive man, but in modern society as well. It helps us to focus on things when we have deadlines. If we're crossing Holborn Viaduct and someone is coming too fast around the corner, it helps us to jump out of the way quickly. So there's nothing wrong with anxiety in general, and in fact we'd have problems if we didn't experience it to some extent. But of course it can get problematic if the danger is one that is imagined rather than real. Or the danger is something which is exaggerated. And in those cases, particularly if the danger is if the perceived danger is out of proportion to the real danger, and it's persistent and disabling, then we would diagnose an anxiety disorder. And about 17% of the population will have an anxiety disorder at some stage in their life. And this is a very costly problem in terms of society. In some figures which are now 15 years old, in the US it cost £42 billion in 1 year in terms of lost productivity and in terms of excessive medical investigations that many people with anxiety seek, often thinking they have a physical problem. And of course, enormous amount of personal hardship. I'm going to focus today on one of the anxiety disorders, social phobia or social anxiety disorder. It's the most common of the anxiety disorders. It has a lifetime prevalence of 12%. So 12% of people will develop it at some stage in their life. It is a persistent fear of social or performance situations. A performance situation, the classic one, is mine today, giving a public presentation. And that problem alone is really very common. About 30% of people will have a fear of public presentations. But thankfully, one can have a perfectly decent life without having to sing for your money in front of an audience. And so most people organize their life so they don't have to do public speaking, and so they don't need to come in for treatment. So it's really the people who have not only a fear of public speaking, but also have a broader range of social fears that tend to be the people who seek treatment. Social fears would be people who are anxious about meeting strangers, people who are anxious about working while being observed, so working in an open plan office, eating in public, eating in restaurants, talking on the telephone while being overheard. Sometimes the people are particularly concerned about talking to strangers, but for other people the fear is much more intense if you're talking to people that you know well, because you then think, well, if they spot the things I'm concerned about, I've got to face them again, and it'd be much more humiliating than if it was with a stranger. In general, in social phobia, it's said that people recognize their fears as excessive or unreasonable, but I think that's only true after the fact. Most people with social phobia think their fears are very realistic when they're anxious, but afterwards, when they calm down, they can see perhaps they were somewhat exaggerated. And because of their concerns, of course, they tend to avoid the situations which trigger their anxiety. But modern life is such that all of us have to meet other people. At work, we have to have contact with people, we have to give small presentations. And so people with social anxiety disorder find that on a daily basis, however hard they try to avoid, they still have to encounter some of their most feared situations. And one of the paradoxes for us in psychiatry is, why don't they get better from that sort of naturalistic exposure? Because it's rarely the case that they get clear-cut negative feedback from other people. It's generally not the case that an adult with social phobia summons up all their courage to go to a party that they've been invited to, and they go and knock on the door of their host, and the host opens the door and says, "Oh my God, why did you think you were invited? I mean, you're the most boring person I know. I mean, we'd never have invited you. I mean, you're going to spoil the whole party." It doesn't happen like that in general, but they think as though it is going to happen that way. And even if they get into the party, they're thinking other people are thinking these things about them. So although there's no unambiguous negative feedback, they're not benefiting from that naturalistic exposure. And that's a puzzle. And it tells us that people must be processing the social situation in a particular way which prevents their fears from extinguishing, prevents them from getting over their fears. And if we can understand that, then that helps us with where we're going in treatment. So a couple of other points about the general characteristics of social phobia, some of which Raj has already mentioned. It typically starts in childhood. The average age of onset is 13, and many people will say that they develop their social phobia before the age of 10, although there are a minority of people who develop it later in life. It also has, for the anxiety disorders, a particularly low natural recovery rate. So in one very clear-cut study that followed people up over 12 years, just over a third of people recovered in that period. And that's much less than with any other anxiety disorder, where a much larger group of people will recover on their own. So it's a pretty persistent problem. And it brings with it an increased risk of suicide, also alcohol and drug abuse, which often seems to develop as a way of trying to deal with the social anxiety. So people often will take a few drinks in order to summon up courage to go to a party, and then find that they're self-medicating in order to get through the day. It also vastly increases your risk of subsequently developing depression and other anxiety disorders. And in general, people with social phobia underachieve both at school and at work. They're more likely, as you heard, to drop out of school early because of their social anxiety. At work, they're less likely to be promoted than would be warranted given their abilities, because sadly in life, promotion isn't simply about how good you are at doing something, it's also about social networking, which they find very difficult. And given all of these points, it's rather sad that it also has a rather low treatment-seeking rate. So only about 10% of people with social anxiety disorder will seek treatment. And that seems to be largely because people don't realise there are effective treatments available. They tend to think they've had it for most of their life, so it's just their personality, and you can't change your personality. And so they feel rather hopeless about it. And there's really a need for a sort of public campaign to publicise the fact that this problem is very treatable, as you'll see in a moment. Well, the typical sort of thoughts that someone with social phobia might have in a difficult social situation are, what I say sounds stupid, I'm boring, I'll make a fool of myself, the other people won't like me, they'll see I'm anxious is the most common thought of all, and I won't have anything to say, and then particular components of being anxious, I'll blush, I'll shake, I'll lose control of myself. There are already a range of treatments available for social anxiety, and I should mention them first before going on to the latest treatment work. There are a number of medications that have been shown to be effective. Broadly speaking, they're all medications that were originally developed as antidepressants. The first and actually the most effective is what's called a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, phenelzine. That has the problem, unfortunately, that you can't take alcohol with it. And so, although it's helpful for many social phobics, it's not a viable treatment because they use a lot of alcohol, and it's actually very dangerous in that combination. Some of the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, fluoxetine is an example, Prozac is its common name, are also effective. But both classes of drugs have the problem that when people stop taking them, there's a fairly high relapse rate. About 50% of people relapse when they stop taking the medications. And as you've probably seen in The Guardian on Friday, there are also other problems with the medications to do with increased suicide risk. The alternative is psychological therapies, and the first psychological therapy that was shown to be effective was exposure therapy, which essentially encourages people in a graded way to go into feared situations and stay in them as long as they can and build up their confidence that way. And then group cognitive behavior therapy is exposure therapy plus adding in some coping technique, conversational skills training, relaxation training, some training in how to improve your eye contact. Which coping technique is added depends rather on the country that it's in. If it's in Germany, there's 1,000 different components of social skills that are taught in one particular program. If it's in Sweden, it's a particularly wonderful form of relaxation, which allows you to relax all the muscles in your body when you're at a bar, other than the muscles that are necessary to stay standing upright while you're holding your beer. And if it's in America, it's very much conversational skills and chat-up routines that you're taught. So the skills really very much reflect the sort of culture that they come from. And the treatment is given in groups because it's thought that people with social phobia may benefit from meeting other people with a similar problem, and it allows them to do role plays and practice difficult tasks together. Well, both of those types of treatments work, but the problem is only about 50% of people will fully recover with that treatment. So only about 50% will no longer have their social phobia. But compared to the drugs, they have the advantage that if you do recover, you stay well. So 5-10 years later, people are essentially in a similar position to where they were at the end of treatment, which is very good news. Well, I'd like to move on to more recent work where the fact that only at best 50% of people recover with existing treatments really got us interested in the problem, and we wondered if it was possible to do better. And we have a particular approach to developing new psychological treatments, which always involves firstly developing a model which would try and explain why people don't get better on their own. So why their fears persist despite the fact that the world is a lot less dangerous than they think it is. And then we test that model to see whether it's correct, and if we get good support for it, then we use that to develop a new treatment where we focus on the things in the model which are preventing people from recovering naturally. If we find problems with the model, we change it until we're happy with it and then devise the treatment. And in social phobia, Adrian Wells and I, a few years ago, suggested that there are 3 main reasons why social fears persist. And the first is what happens when people are anxious in terms of their attention. And there seems to be a shift of people's focus of attention. So when people with social anxiety are meeting other people, they often say they become very self-conscious. Their attention shifts onto themselves rather than onto other people. And they become very aware of how they feel and how they think they're coming across, but they're paying very little attention to other people. Now, this is a problem, because of course, if things go well, the chances are they won't notice, and so they won't benefit from that. But sadly, it's much worse than that, because when they focus on themselves, they then become aware of information in themselves which they take as evidence that their fears are realistic. And there are 2 examples of this. You remember I said that the most common thought in social phobia is that other people can see that you're anxious. Well, if you ask people with social phobia, how do you know? Occasionally they'll say, well, someone said that they saw I was anxious. But in general, they don't say that. In general, they say, well, I feel very anxious. And if I feel very anxious, I must look very anxious. So they're using their feelings to decide how they appear. Well, it turns out that's a terrible mistake, because there's a lot of research that shows the more anxious you feel, the more you overestimate how anxious you look. It goes beyond that, though. For most people with social anxiety, they report little mental pictures or images that pop into their head when they're anxious. And the image has particular problematic qualities. It's as though there's a video camera in the corner of the room and they can see themselves as if observed by someone else, what we call an observer perspective. Now, Robbie Burns said that it would be wonderful to be able to observe ourselves as others see us, but sadly for the social phobic, that's not what their image is. Their image is not how they really appear to other people, but instead it's all their fears visualized. So for example, one of my patients a little while ago was a young teacher, and her biggest fear was the coffee break at school, where she would have to sit with other teachers and chat to them, and she thought that if she opened her mouth, everyone would think she was stupid, and so she rarely talked. And when she was summoning up her courage to try and talk, she would then feel tense around her lips, and that feeling of tension around her lips would get transformed into an image where she would see herself looking like this. And if you asked her, what does that look like? She would say, the village idiot. And she didn't need to observe how other people responded to her, because she already knew they could see she's stupid, because she had this picture in her mind. So we have a real problem that people are focusing on themselves rather than other people, and then they're generating very misleading ideas about how they appear from these distorted images that look very realistic and they believe them, and also from jumping to conclusions from their feelings in a way which is misleading. And those two alone are quite powerful ways of keeping your fears going. But sadly, there's another influence which is even more dramatic. And that's what we call safety behaviors. A safety behavior is something that someone would do in order to prevent a feared event from happening. So if you take the patient I've just talked about, she's afraid that if she speaks, other people will think she's stupid. And so she then has a lot of strategies to try and prevent that from happening. One obvious one, of course, is to try and avoid speaking. Another one is to write out before the coffee break a list of 10 interesting topics that she could introduce into the conversation to the other teachers. And the last one is, if she does manage to summon up her courage to speak, while she's speaking, she will memorize everything she's already said and compare it with what she's about to say in order to check that it makes sense, that it's interesting enough and it's clever enough. Now, this is an enormous mental load. And so what happens, of course, is that when she's speaking to other people, it appears as though she's not interested in them. It appears as though her mind is somewhere else, which it is. It's on all this memorizing. And of course, in general, if someone's talking to you, or you're in a conversation with them, but they don't seem to be very interested in you, how do you respond? Not many of us become much more friendly. Most of us withdraw in reaction, don't we? We're less friendly back. And so the real paradox here is that these safety behaviors do two very unhelpful things. Firstly, if the conversation does go all right, the patient can say, but that's only because I did all this memorizing and thought of all these clever topics. If I had just been myself, everyone would have realized what a stupid, boring person I am. So the fear persists. But it's worse than that, because of course this distracted, mind elsewhere appearance affects the person that you're talking to, and they're less friendly to you. And so some of the things that the patient is afraid of actually happen as a consequence of the things they're doing to try and protect themselves. Does that make sense? So, a very problematic system. Well, that's a theory. And in psychiatry, we think of theories as rather like bedtime stories. They may be true or they may not be. Mostly they're not, it turns out. So the first thing you have to do with a theory is test it, see if you can get any good evidence for it. And I'm going to quickly take you through some of the tests of the key points that I've been mentioning. Now, the first thing is it the case that people with social anxiety do shift their focus of attention so they're not observing other people and are focusing on themselves when they get anxious? And this is a study that we did looking at that with one of my team, Warren Mansell. He took high and low socially anxious individuals and he gave them two things to do at the same time. On a computer screen, they saw different people, and every now and again there was a dot appeared on the face of one of the people, and they just had to detect it as quickly as possible, press a button. So that's detecting something in the external world. They also were wired up with very impressive cardiac and sweating monitoring systems, and then they were told that a little vibrator that they had on their finger, if that started to vibrate, it meant we detected a change in their physiological responding. Their heart rate had gone up or their skin conductance had changed. Okay. The sort of things, of course, that people with social anxiety are concerned about, because they think, oh, I'm getting a bit more of an anxious reaction, other people will see it. Okay. Now, being a psychology experiment, actually this was all false feedback. So they just got the buzzer on a fixed schedule, but they did know that we could monitor these things, so they thought it was realistic. Okay, and then people were tested under two conditions. One is just sitting quietly, there's no particular threat. And then the other is they're told that in a minute you're going to have to give a speech to an assembled audience. And this particular study we did actually on Oxford undergraduates who tend to be on average fairly self-confident people, so we had to sort of rack up the threat. So we said that the people who are watching you are experts in non-verbal behaviour, and their judgments over a number of years have been shown to be very good predictors of your final income level. This is a wonderful threat for Oxford undergraduates. And so even the low socially anxious ones got anxious in this task. It wasn't true, by the way, these psychologists can't predict those sort of things. Well, what happens? Well, in the no threat condition, here you see a positive score means you're better at detecting things in the external world, you're focused externally. A negative score means you're better at detecting things in your body, you're focused internally. And you see, without a threat, both the low social anxious group and the high social anxious group tend to be more external. If you take the low socially anxious people and you threaten them with having to speak to a critical audience, you'll notice something very interesting happens. They become more external. It's like they're focusing on the audience, trying to mentally engage them already. But the high socially anxious people do the exact opposite. They now go into an internal focus of attention. They're not paying any attention to the external world. They're locked in on themselves and they're self-monitoring. Well, when they do that, of course, I was telling you a story. I was saying, and they have these particular images. But is that really true? Psychiatrists and psychologists tend to come to these conclusions from talking to one or two people and then generalizing to the rest of the universe. And that's a very dangerous thing. So we wanted to check whether, in this case, this generalization was true. We did an interview study where we took people with social phobia and other individuals and asked them whether they had an image the last time they're anxious in a social situation, and then inquired about the content of the image and whether it was an observer perspective image or not. And the finding was quite remarkable. If you just take the last time people felt anxious in a social situation, the people with social phobia, 80% of them reported having a spontaneously occurring, just pops into your head, negative observer perspective image, which at the time seemed realistic, but afterwards many of them thought was perhaps somewhat distorted. A very negative image. The non-social phobics don't do that to anything like the same extent, just 10%. And when you look at the images, they're much less negative. Well, where do these images come from? A chance question in this study led us to the answer. The interviewer happened to say to someone, and you know that image of seeing yourself beetroot red with white globules of sweat dripping down your forehead at that dinner that you were invited to? Have you ever had that image before? And the patient said, yes. How often? Well, whenever I get very anxious, I have the same image. Maybe in a different place, and that bit's changed, but the essential picture of how I look is the same. And then the therapist said, well, and when did you first experience that image? And it tracked way back into childhood for this particular patient. So this led us to the idea, maybe these images are laid down quite early in life on the basis of traumatic experiences, and then they just keep on getting rolled out, irrespective of whether they're realistic or relevant. And so in a follow-up study, we looked at that. We first looked at whether it's generally the case that people have these repeated images, and we found 100% of our social phobic patients said they had recurrent images. And then we looked at how those images clustered with respect to the onset of their social phobia. Now, these were people who were coming in for treatment on average 20 years after developing the problem. But you see, the images were first experienced clustering around the onset of the problem. It's often something like standing up at school, having to read out a Longfellow poem or something like that, and then starting to feel a bit hot in your face, your hand shakes a little bit, and then you have an image of looking at shaking, gibbering wreck, and that image, whether it's realistic or not, then seems to get sort of stuck, and whenever you feel anxious again in the future, it gets wheeled out, and it's believed, even if it may not be at all relevant now. Now, I also said that these particular safety behaviours that people do, the memorising and other things, are one reason why their fears persist. And so to test this, we did a little experiment where we asked people with social anxiety to do a particular difficult task, which was individualised. So for one of our patients, who actually was a priest, his particular most feared situation was giving communion, and it was actually the communion cup. And so his task was to do that. For other people, it might have been giving a public presentation or talking to strangers. And people did it under one of two conditions. In one condition, they were asked to do all the things they normally do to try and manage their anxiety. So to prepare in advance, to do the memorizing if they normally do that. In the case of this particular priest, to hold the chalice very tightly to avoid shaking. Okay. And that seemed very credible to people. We thought, well, this is a good thing to do. We're using all our coping techniques and we're confronting the situation. But the other group were told to do the task, but were told it will be of no benefit unless you learn something new about your fears, unless you discover that the fears are unrealistic. And the only way of doing that is actually to drop all these self-protective strategies. So not to do the memorizing. In this particular case, the priest would have to hold the chalice with one hand and just hold it on the bottom and tip like that. Okay. Patients also thought this was quite credible, actually, as it happened. But what happens in terms of the outcome? Well, this was an experiment, so it was just one session of therapy, and we looked at people's anxiety before and afterwards in another difficult social situation. And we found that if you were encouraged to keep your safety behaviours, then there was really no improvement in your anxiety, very little change, just a little bit of a drop, and very little change in your fearful beliefs. However, if you do the same task but you drop these safety behaviours, sometimes just strategies you're doing in your head, the memorising, then you get a very big improvement in anxiety and a big change in your fears as well. So it does seem as those little safety behaviours are really crucial in keeping the fears going. Okay, well, I'd now like to move on to how those ideas pan out in therapy. And I'd like to show you some stages of the therapy. Firstly, it involves working out with the patient an individual version of the sort of model of these maintaining factors, and they see how they fit together. And we often write that up on the board. And here's the example with the teacher that we were talking about. So in the coffee break, which would be the situation, she'd had the thought, I'll sound stupid. And that would give her an image of looking very strange with a twisted and rigid mouth. And when she had that, she would be even more convinced she'd sound stupid. But she also does a lot of safety behaviours. Before speaking, she delays asking questions, trying to calm down. And she takes deep breaths in order to relax more. And when she feels that she's ready, she'll then speak quickly because she doesn't want to be the centre of attention for long. And she'll tend to mumble and put her hand over her mouth. Now, this unfortunately has a consequence that people can't hear what she says and so stare at her, which produces the exact wrong reaction from her point of view. But she's also doing all this rehearsing and memorising and checking her memory. And all of these make her more self-conscious and more aware of this image of herself and more convinced that things are going badly. Well, once you develop the model with the patient and checked out that that makes sense, that really seems to describe their experience, they're happy with that, you then try and break into the cycles in the model. And the first thing we do is show people how these safety behaviours and focusing on yourself are unhelpful. And rather than telling people that, we let them experience that. And we do it by what we call a little experiment, the self-focused attention and safety behaviours experiment, where we get them to, in the clinic, do something that's quite difficult but they think they could manage, like talk to a stranger or stand up and give a short presentation. And they do it twice. Once while they're doing it, they focus their attention on themselves, keep on thinking, how am I coming across? Am I looking anxious? What is the other person thinking about me? What's my voice sound like? All the things they would normally do. And in the other condition, they're asked to do something which they wouldn't normally do, which is not monitor how they think they're coming across, not try and cover up their anxiety. If they're worried about their hands shaking, instead of holding something very rigidly, just hold it gently and not try and control it. And not think of lots of clever topics, just say things as they come into their head. And we get them to do each of those things and then compare how they felt and how they think they came across. And it's a miraculous exercise, because what happens is that in general people find that they feel a lot less anxious when they drop all of these self-protective strategies, and when, rather than trying to hide how they come across to other people or put on a front, they just let themselves say what comes into their mind and be themselves. So they feel less anxious. They also think they come across much better. And so they're very pleased with the first step of therapy. They think this is going to be helpful. But the next thing we move on to is dealing with these images. And of course, all that we've got so far is that they think they're coming across better, but it's still the case that they think they come across pretty badly. It's just a small improvement as far as they're concerned. And so the next thing we do is video feedback. So we've videoed all of this therapy. In fact, every second of the therapy is videoed. And in the next session, you get an opportunity to watch the video of this role play and see how you came across. And this is a wonderful thing, because it really does allow you to see your true observable self. And for those people who are worried about blushing, for example, what we do is we have, unbeknownst to them, a series of books of different shades of red on the bookshelf behind them. And if they feel they've blushed, we ask them to turn around and point to the red that they think it was. And although sometimes, of course, the blushing is visible, they will always point to a much deeper red than the real one. And it's a very nice way of showing them that whatever is observed, their image is much more negative. Okay. And this turned out to be a very powerful technique for people to realize that their self-images are extremely distorted. And it moves us on to the next stage in therapy, which involves saying, so all the evidence you've been using so far to decide how you come across, your feelings and your images, is poor evidence. It doesn't tell you how you appear to other people. So what we've now got to do is get good evidence, things that is realistic. And that involves teaching people to shift their focus of attention so they're out of their head and into the social interaction. And to do even more than that, to try and test their beliefs by doing little experiments. And an example of that is here with the same teacher that I'll keep the story going with. This was her first what we call behavioural experiment. So we took the coffee break, which is her feared situation, sitting with other teachers, trying to join in the conversation. And the first thing you do is you ask her to predict what's the worst that you think could happen. And she says, well, if I just say things that come into my mind without monitoring it, without thinking of clever things, they'll all think I'm stupid. And she believes that 50%. So that's her prediction. And so then we sit down together and think, well, how could we test that? How could we find out whether that's true? And we decide on an experiment. And the experiment is, well, this time I have to do something very risky, but it'll be worthwhile, because maybe I'll discover the truth. what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and say whatever comes into my mind and watch the other people like a hawk, like a bird of prey. Don't focus on myself, because this only gives me misleading information. She's discovered that from the video, and means that I can't see the other people. So that's the plan, and that's written down on a little sheet. And then next morning she goes into the school and she tries out the experiment. And so she has to record the outcome, what actually happened. And she writes down, well, I did it and I watched the others. One of them showed interest in me and we talked. She actually seemed to quite enjoy it. And then the last column is, well, what have I learned from that? And you can see she says, well, I'm probably more acceptable than I think. She says, I believe that's 70%. Well, that's good, we're moving in the right direction, but you notice the probably. That's a doubt, isn't it? And the art of cognitive therapy is always to listen for the doubts and not push them under the carpet, but get them out and discuss them. And so I said to her, well, and what was unconvincing about that to you? And she said, oh, I don't know. Well, I don't think they really saw the real me. If they had, maybe it would have been different. I said, well, in what way did they not see the real you? Remember we agreed you wouldn't plan any tasks, any topics to introduce into the conversation. You just say things as they came into your mind. Was that true? Did you manage that? She said, well, you know, I normally have a list of 10, and I was really good, and I only took in 2. And I said, and what do you think would have happened if you hadn't brought in 2 topics? She said, oh, well, then people would have realised I'm stupid. I said, okay, that's a prediction again, isn't it? How can we test that? And she says, okay, I'm getting the hang of this, so no topics tomorrow. I said, yeah, okay, let's try that. So she then goes in, no topics. And actually the conversation goes swimmingly, because for the first time for her colleagues, it's a real conversation. She's not changing the topic all the time to go on to a new clever topic. She's following what everyone's saying, and it flows nicely. So actually 3 people stay a bit longer and chat with her. And now the outcome is, I really am more acceptable than I thought. Well, cognitive therapy involves a vast number of behavioural experiments like that, which people use to test their beliefs. And you can see a lot of fine-tuning and expressing doubts, taking them seriously and then testing them out. And one of the later stages of therapy is something that I thought I'd mention, which is that at these sort of experiments build people's confidence. And so what you tend to do in the later stages is look at the worst possible outcomes. So say, okay, well, you can see that the things you're afraid of are much less likely to happen than you thought, but let's consider the worst and see how bad that would be. And what we then often do is we get people to behave in ways that they feel are unacceptable, to do things that are breaking their rules, because they often have very rigid, high performance rules, and we get them to break them. So, for example, someone who's worried that they might sound stupid when they're talking may have a rule that they must never have a pause in their conversation. They should never put a big gap in the conversation, because if they do, people will notice it, will stare at them, think they're dumb. Well, I've just tested that rule a moment ago. There's a podcast, I think, or a video cast of this lecture. You can look at it on the internet later. About 8 or 9 sentences ago, I paused mid-sentence and counted to myself 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 while watching you all to see whether you noticed. And I don't know whether anyone noticed, but certainly people didn't react with horror. But for the social phobics, this would have been a terribly frightening thing to do. But the reaction would have been the same, and they'd have realised, this is okay, it's acceptable. Similarly, to give you an example, one of our patients was very worried about underarm sweating. And he would sweat a lot, and he felt so humiliated by this concern that 8 or 9 times every day he would lock himself in a gents' toilet. And you know those sort of dry, blow dryers where you can dry your hands, that's how, he would turn it the other way around and dry his armpits. And he was horrified that people in the company would come in and see this. This was his worst possible fear. And so I said, well, you know, if it gets really bad, what's the worst that you think it could be? And he said, oh, it could be just an enormous patch like that. Now, of course, I'm feeling a lot more confident, so it's not really happening now, but it could one day. So he said, and what do you think would happen if that was the case? Said, oh, well, people would be absolutely disgusted and horrified if they ever saw sweat like that on a man. Okay. I said, well, shall we test that? And he said, well, I'm not sweating very much now. I said, well, that's all right, because it's the appearance that we need. So we both got a large bottle of mineral water and went out of the clinic. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening, around the corner to a local store. I think it was a 7-Eleven store. And then we decided we had to produce the appearance of intense sweat. So basically we produced something like this, both arms actually, but I won't do that with the microphone here. And then I said to him, okay, now if we go into the store and ask for something and people can see that, how do you think they'll react? And he said, oh, well, they'll be disgusted. And how will you know? Well, it could go one of two ways. One possibility is they'll just be so embarrassed that they'll look anywhere other than my armpit. You know, they'll look around like this, but they won't look at me. The other thing is they'll be so disgusted they won't be able to take their eyes off my armpit. But it'll be one or the other. Okay. So, okay, well, let's test that. Now, who should do it first? Do you want me to do it, and you watch, or the other way around? I said, well, why don't you do it? So I went in and went up to the checkout. There's a very nice young lady behind it, and I said, excuse me, can you tell me how much those AA batteries are there, just behind you? And she said, oh, £1.80 or something. I said, well, thank you very much. It's a bit expensive for me. What about the ever-ready sort over there? Are they any cheaper? And she said, still £1.80. I said, well, thanks, maybe another day. And wandered along to the patient who was here by the bread counter watching all of this and said, well, what did you make of that? And he said, I couldn't believe it. I mean, you were that close. There was no possibility that she didn't see it, but she just answered your question. I mean, she may not have thought it was great, but she obviously wasn't totally disgusted in the way I thought. So what does that tell you? Well, sweating isn't as bad as I thought it was, at least on you. I said, well, tell me about that. He said, well, maybe it wouldn't work the same for me. Why is that? Well, we've had 5 sessions of therapy now. I'm getting used to you. You're a pretty extrovert chap. I mean, I think you can get away with some things that I can't. Okay, that's a prediction. How can we test that out? So he gets out the mineral water, and we go to the next store, and he asks essentially the same thing for a packet of cigarettes. And it turns out his armpits are of no more interest to the man behind the counter as mine were. And a wonderfully liberating experience for him. Well, that I hope gives you a flavour for what's in the therapy, and I'd like to just wind up by looking at the question, does it work, and showing you a couple of bits of data. The first is a clinical trial where people with social anxiety, severe social anxiety, are randomly allocated to either cognitive therapy, Prozac, or a placebo medication. And you find that people improve actually in all 3 conditions, but people with cognitive therapy show twice as much improvement as people on Prozac, and that difference is maintained 1 year later. And then the second study really looks at, which is IMPRESS, looks at how cognitive therapy compares with the best alternative existing psychological treatments. You remember exposure therapy was one of the key ones. And this is no treatment. And you find that those people who have exposure therapy do much better than people without any treatment. It's an effective treatment. But cognitive therapy again does about twice as well. 84% of the patients in cognitive therapy no longer had the diagnosis of social phobia at the end of the treatment, as opposed to 38% of those people with exposure therapy. So it works very well in our clinic. However, there's always a concern in psychotherapy that, you know, maybe these things don't travel so well to other places. And so the last thing I'd like to show you is a study that was done in Stockholm by another group of clinicians who actually particularly thought group treatment would be the ideal, and they developed their own version of a group cognitive behavioural treatment and contacted us to say, could we train them in our treatment as the placebo control? So their belief obviously was that they would do much better with the group treatment. And they also compared it with treatment as usual in Sweden, which is getting Prozac and other SSRIs. And you can see that cognitive therapy, individual cognitive therapy, still does very well, significantly better than the Swedish group treatment, although that was what everyone thought was going to do well, and both of them are doing somewhat better than the medication. So thank you very much for joining me on this trip through social anxiety, and I'd like to pause now and see if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, David. So we're going to take some questions now. I hope after that very enlightening and entertaining lecture, none of you will be suffering from any social anxiety in terms of asking a question. And if you could wait till the microphone gets to you so that the people on the webcast can hear your question, that would be great, and also the people downstairs. And don't be afraid to put your hand up and worry about your armpits as well. We'll take this question here.
Do you think it's possible that people give people exposure therapy without telling them that's what they're doing?
Sorry, did you say that?
Do you think it's possible people work exposure therapy on people without telling them that's what they're doing?
Oh, I see. I mean, people are sort of trying to do exposure therapy without you knowing that you're a subject of that therapy.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I would hope not. I mean, the whole key about psychological treatments is that they're consensual therapies, and furthermore, in cognitive therapy, I think the key is a very close collaborative relationship. What you do, Beck, who invented the cognitive therapy approach, talks about people seeing their thoughts as hypotheses, and the therapist and the client together are a sort of scientific team that are working to find out what's correct and what isn't. Sure. And so it really relies on a very close collaboration. In general, psychological treatments rely on that, and if they're done in any other way, they can be very unhelpful. So, sometimes friends and colleagues try to push people into situations, thinking they're helping. Sure. But if they're not bringing the person along in a consensual way, it can often backfire as well.
Okay, sure. Okay, thank you.
There's a question here.
Well, two questions. One, your teacher, how did she perform in the classroom? And two, more or less comment as a question. If I go to a meeting, I prepare for it.
Yes.
Likewise, if I'm going to meet with friends and I know what they're going to talk about or what their interests are, likewise, I prepare for that, or make sure that I look at the news, what we're interested in.
Yes.
Well, surely that's a good thing.
Okay, two separate questions.
Yes.
So the first question was, how did that particular person manage in the classroom? Actually very well, and that illustrates sort of one of the interesting things about social anxiety, that often the fears are really very specific to particular situations. So she was not at all concerned about her performance in front of the children, and was a very gifted teacher actually, but was really very concerned about her evaluation by her peers. But in the issue of preparing for giving talks at work or going to dinner and things like that, of course many of us prepare in advance for things, and I would have been silly if I hadn't prepared my PowerPoint for today. So the issue really is two things. One is, does it get excessive? And more importantly, it's the beliefs behind it. So someone with a disabling social phobia would think, and if they hadn't done all that preparing in advance, they would be rejected as a person, because people would think that basically they're uninteresting and boring. Whereas for most other people, they might think, well, it's nice to think of some things that other people are interested in, but they're not going to think I'm a very boring person who's unacceptable if I don't do that. I'm just being polite by adding a little bit of social oil to an enjoyable occasion. Does that make sense?
I think there was a question back there.
Okay.
There's a lady right here in the front.
I was wondering what happens if you've got another if you've got another psychological or psychiatric problems, let's just say a personality disorder, so on top of having the social phobia, what does it do to the outcome of the treatment, or do you treat it in a different way?
Yes, I mean, we have looked at that actually, particularly in this last trial, which was that one there. People had a range of personality disorders and actually didn't make a difference in terms of the outcome of the social phobia, which is good news. And I think that's maybe because there's a lot of emphasis on this therapy in producing that close collaborative relationship, and it seems to work well. However, that doesn't necessarily mean to say that the other personality problems will go away with that treatment. And so for people who have several problems, clinically it's very important to sit down with them at the start of a course of therapy and work out how these problems are interrelated, what they'd like to focus on first, and also what's the most sensible thing to focus on first, because sometimes they're not the same. If you get someone coming in to the clinic who's very depressed and also is very concerned about whether or not they should leave their partner or get divorced or something, they may say that that's the most important thing they have to sort out. They have to sort that out today. But actually, that's probably not the most helpful thing to do, because that's a difficult decision at the best of times. But if you're also profoundly depressed, which affects your problem solving, it's going to be very difficult to do that. So you then may together decide that we'll do some things to try and generally move your mood up somewhat before then discussing that other issue. But it's very important that therapists look at the whole person, and so it's not just this one problem, and look at how they interrelate.
You said that one of the most common thoughts these people have is that my anxiety will be visible to others.
Yes.
But you also had another thought, which is that others will not like me.
Yes.
Do we know what the effects of that would be? That others will, I will not be liked by others. Does that have any self-fulfilling effects?
Well, I mean, in general, we find in social phobia that you have this problem. All right, so
you've got to hold the microphone very close to your mouth when you're speaking.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah, can you repeat my question?
I can,
yeah,
yes.
okay.
So the question was, if you take people who have the thought, other people won't like me, is that thought a self-fulfilling prophecy? And the answer is, to some extent it is, because people who have that thought then often are much more withdrawn in their behavior. They hide themselves so people don't get to know the real them. And so it's not necessarily that other people actively dislike them, but they don't get to know them and are not so interested in them. And there is a very nice experiment that was done a number of years ago on this, where there's an American experiment. They got two students to have a conversation, and then after the conversation, they then went into separate rooms, and one of the students was given a questionnaire which they were told had been filled in by the other student. And for half of the students, the questionnaire basically indicated that the other student didn't like you. And for the other half of the students, it indicated the other student thought you were very interesting. Okay? And then, but this, wasn't true. I mean, the experimenters had just produced these questionnaires. And then the students came back together for another conversation. And lo and behold, what happened is that the person who'd received the questionnaire saying that the other person didn't like them, at the end of the second conversation, didn't like the first person. Whereas if they'd received the questionnaire and they were told the other person liked them, then they did like them much more. And they looked closely at how this worked, and it was actually to do with them adjusting their behaviour, being more or less friendly, and then the other person matching that. Does that make sense? Mm. So that's one of the real problems in social anxiety. It's one of the few anxiety disorders where some of the fears that people have actually become true. But thankfully, it's because of something that they can control when they understand it, which is their safety behaviours. And they learn in therapy to drop them, and then they find they're perfectly acceptable.
Do you have the statistics for improvement with one-to-one cognitive therapy? And also it seems to me that when people bring these negative images from the past, that's not terribly disparate from depressive behaviour and lack of self-esteem. So I wondered whether you work generally to increase people's self-esteem.
Yes, okay. So, I mean, I should have made this clear. Actually, our treatment is an individual cognitive therapy. So it's not a group treatment. And in fact, we find it works better in individuals. However, there's still a lot of social tasks, so we will bring other people into the therapy sessions to do role plays and things with the patient, but the basic therapy is individual. And so that's where you get these very high response rates. Yes, of course, some people have broader self-esteem issues, and also with those images, sometimes you have to deal with them by going back into the past. So I didn't really talk about that in the short time I had to cover it, but you might start, if the image is about blushing and things, by doing the video feedback, and in fact sometimes we also get people to wear blusher and wander out in the streets and see how people react. And a lot of people respond well to that, but some people still find they get this intrusive image in their head, and then we often have to go back into the past with them and deal with that earlier experience. It may be that they were very severely criticized as a child, and there we do what's called a memory or an image rescripting, where we get them first to bring the negative image to mind, hold it in mind long enough to sort of feel all the bad feelings associated with it, and then we get them to open their eyes and maybe spend half an hour, 20 minutes sort of discussing what was really going on in that situation and whether that really applies to their current life or not. And often they find it doesn't apply to their current life. It's like a haunting from the past. And then we do this trick which comes from Gestalt therapy, where we often then get them to close their eyes again, and if it's a child, they then, in imagery, have their adult self go and talk to the child and do various helpful therapeutic things with the child. And then that seems to rid them of that sort of intrusive image, that sort of ghost from the past. But sometimes it's necessary to do that. So although cognitive therapy is predominantly a present-focused therapy, it doesn't stay in the present if it gets stuck.
There was a question here.
Oh, thank you. My question follows on pretty much from hers.
Yes.
You talked about it manifesting itself when you're like 13.
Yes.
Are these people that have been ignored by their parents or put down by their parents? Or what kind of families did they come through? Inadequate mothers that felt terrible about themselves, so they took it out on their child? What is the story?
Yeah, well, I think as with most anxiety disorders, the sort of different etiological factors are really quite complex, and it's a whole series of things interacting. So there is a strong genetic component actually to the development of social anxiety. So some children, for genetic reasons, are just born much shyer. But then there are also family experiences and school experiences which sort of stamp further concerns on that particular vulnerability. And certainly it is the case that some patients give painful accounts of being ignored at a crucial
You can't just
moment.
say something like, buck up, stop being so self-centered, you know? That would be my approach.
As in therapy? Oh, I see. Well, I mean, it may well be that there's some people in the community who respond perfectly well to that, but by the time you get to a professional, you know, people have tried that a lot, and so there's no point in trying things that haven't worked. Okay. So it's a mixture of sort of different painful traumatic experiences that is painful to the person, and also their sort of personality and what they came into the world with in terms of the vulnerabilities.
We're running out of time because there's a rule at Gresham, which is we don't go beyond 7. So we are running out. Let's take one or two very more.
Yeah, I wonder whether you could say something about using your techniques more generally. It's quite a expensive process, this one-to-one therapy, yes. And we're told that the NHS is rather short of money. So,
yes.
What do you think about all that?
Well, both of those are true. However, Lord Layard, who's a economics professor from LSE, has been looking at this rather closely, he and I together, and we've done some cost-benefit analyses of this. And we reckon that these therapies would pay for themselves if made more generally available. And that is because although a course of cognitive therapy, if delivered individually, would probably cost between about sort of £800 and £1,200, depending on how it's delivered and things like that, and how long it goes on for. If you look at the benefits of the therapy in hard economic terms, so for example, if you look at the number of people who are unemployed and can then go back into work as a function of overcoming their anxiety problems, or the number of people who are working part-time who have then increased their work, or the number of people who have sick days and they have less of them, and you look at people moving from incapacity benefit to not being on incapacity benefit, that alone more than covers the cost of therapy. And then you can add in other benefits. So for example, in general for anxiety disorders, people with anxiety disorders have a lot of unnecessary physical investigations. They often go to their GP with worries and concerns, and the GP often responds by sending them along for an extra physical test, or a lot of unnecessary brain scans, body scans, things like that. They are incredibly expensive, and there is evidence that if people overcome their anxiety problem, they no longer have those excess investigations. So if you just take those two together, you find that it more than pays for itself, and that's just direct government savings. So that's the government savings from reducing incapacity benefit, the increased revenue to the exchequer from taxation for people working more, and the reduced cost to the NHS. And so just as a government equation in a nationalised health service, it's economic. But to society, the equation is even more positive, because if you then look at companies, for example, the changes in productivity as a function of people having less sick days and things are also enormous economic benefits. And then that's not putting a cost on the increased happiness that people have and the improvement in their life and their families' lives. So we think you're quids in with this.
I think we've got time for one last question.
Yes, my question is slightly tongue-in-cheek, and you could be forgiven for taking it with a pinch of salt. I arrived at your lecture 5 minutes late,
right,
and stood at the back for 2 minutes, agonising what to do, since I saw there was an empty seat on the front row.
Absolutely, that's my seat.
I was torn between two issues. One, I would draw attention to myself if I came and sat here, and two, I would disturb people unacceptably. Was that an example of successful or failed social behaviour?
Well, it's a prediction, isn't it? So we can test it with the audience. Were you seriously disturbed by this gentleman coming in? No. Okay, one person, but not in general. I wasn't disturbed either. So you were very brave, but it sounds like the prediction was unrealistic.
It brings in matters of ethics and culture and being considerate, right?
Yes.
Which is a different field, or is it?
Cognitive therapy is always done in a particular cultural context, and it's very important to understand that and to operate within it. And so the exact ways in which the therapy plays out varies quite a lot depending on people's culture and their background.
Well, I'll make a social prediction, which is that you have learned a great deal this evening about previous hitherto misunderstood but very widespread disorder. I hope you'll join me in thanking Professor David Clark for a most entertaining and enjoyable lecture. Thank you.